In an effort to take away your right to defend yourself and certainly have access to the firearms to do so, apparently there's nothing that Attorney General Bob Ferguson won't do. Now, when Bob Ferguson in Washington State, our Attorney General here, unfortunately, when he isn't dumping violent sex offenders in your neighborhood next to your kids, it appears that Attorney General Bob Ferguson's actually hiring pathological liars to help him craft his public policy. Now, today's story is really focused on Washington State's Democrat Attorney General Bob Ferguson, who's working hard to become Washington State's next governor after the current Governor Inslee's administration kind of winds itself down with just a whimper next year. I've produced a few videos about the status of the 2024 election and kind of the early jockeying by the candidates, and AG Ferguson is clearly the Democrats' front runner for this position at this time. However, this video is really not about his governor's campaign. Instead, I really want to focus on some public records that have recently come to light from the Attorney General's office that clearly demonstrate how our AG Bob Ferguson is willing to lie and hire documented liars to promote his anti-gun, anti-self-defense strategy. Like everything else that Ferguson does, this policy emphasis has kind of a certain rational strategy behind it. This strategy is based, like so many other things that Ferguson has done in his career, on money. I mean, he really needs more cash to run a statewide gubernatorial campaign, particularly with the negative view that a lot of people have of him. And if there's one thing that billionaires have, it's cash. And, of course, one of the long-standing focuses of so many billionaires in Washington State and around the country has been their priority of disarming citizens like you and I so that we can't defend ourselves from crime or criminals. Now, this has become Ferguson's personal pet cause as well, which is smart because this will help him open the floodgates of big cash infusions into his campaign. I mean, every billionaire from Bill Gates to Michael Bloomberg to Nick Hanauer to George Soros, they all have prioritized disarming Americans, and there is no limit to the cash that they'll infuse into their kind of pet politicians like Ferguson, who actually help in this effort. Now, for the billionaires and their pet politicians like Ferguson, this really has not been as easy as they probably thought it would be. And first of all, our country has a very clear constitutional protection outlined in the Second Amendment, which has annoyed them almost as much as the First Amendment. The billionaires and the leftists who join them really can't figure out why it's so difficult to implement their censorship and disarmament program, and why Americans, for some strange reason, well, we don't just want to be silenced and disarmed with these guys in charge. I mean, why can't they get Americans to just roll over and die? Now, I'm sure this resistance mystifies them, but they have a lot of support from politicians that they own, like Bob Ferguson, who's clearly willing to do most of the dirty work for them, as long as the campaign cash keeps flowing. Bob's going to keep selling his soul, whatever's left of it, to get the ring of power in the governor's mansion, and attacking Washington State's citizens and crushing their ability to protect themselves is a very clear priority of Ferguson. However, neither Ferguson nor his billionaire funders can make this all happen on their own, so they need to squander taxpayer cash on experts who are willing to lie and basically lie often for them. I mean, this is another example where outsourcing is in full swing. Now, one of these experts hired last year by Bob Ferguson's, this guy right here, according to public records, at an eye-popping $1,000 per hour is Saul Cornell, who's apparently a professor of history at Fordham University, who was exposed last year, actually, in an article written by Kevin Williamson at the National Review, and other similar articles that were debunking Saul Cornell's attempt to falsify history, fabricate facts, and then fake everything in the goal of justifying the disarmament of Americans, and of course, undermining the constitutional protections that are very clearly spelled out by the Second Amendment. Now, well, people are probably aware that professors like Cornell lie frequently and often when they're on campus. This is what all leftists must do in order to survive in that profession. So it just becomes really another story entirely when you provide fake evidence to the courts. In law enforcement, there's actually something called a Bradys List, which was essentially created back in the 1960s as a way for the court system to verify or challenge whether a law enforcement officer's testimony should be accepted at face value. Those who'd been caught lying in the past or who were guilty of other types of very clear misconduct were to be identified in criminal cases where their testimony was presented. However, there's really nothing equivalent to this for college professors, probably because it would empty our university's ivory towers and they'd become ghost towns. However, to Washington State's Bob Ferguson, nothing supports his decision to hire a liar more than realizing that same liar is going to support your cause of attacking the freedom of Washington State's residents, and most importantly, to keep their ability to own firearms, or at least remove it as soon as you can. So a few months ago, and this is basically the email right here, after Professor Cornell was exposed as a liar several months after that to the court, Bob Ferguson basically gave him just this big fat payday and hired him to assist Ferguson last August in the AG's office in their effort to make Washington State a much more dangerous place for the rest of us. Now, for clarity, I see no evidence of Bob Ferguson's using this lying professor to assist in Ferguson's pet project of dumping violent sex predators quietly in neighborhoods next to children. No, that policy right now, from what I can see, is almost entirely owned by Bob Ferguson alone. No, this professor instead was just being used to help Ferguson justify or at least provide fake testimony to assist him in Ferguson's many legal fights, which have been winding themselves kind of through the whole court system for a few years now, really since I-1639 was passed. Now, interestingly, recent records requests have uncovered these emails between Bob Ferguson's office and Professor Cornell, where he kind of establishes his billing rate, looks like around $1,000 per hour, your dollars, your taxpayer dollars. And this was many months after it became public that the guy's clearly not attached to the truth very much. Now, Ferguson doesn't care, of course. I mean, it isn't his money. It's your money that he plans to waste on this guy. And why should Ferguson care about the truth? I mean, as long as people say what he wants them to say, what does he really care? I mean, he doesn't. Ferguson never has, and unfortunately, it's rare to find anyone in state government today who cares about the truth. The only thing that they seem to care about is their narrative, and Ferguson's no different. His rapacious quest for political power, regardless of the trail of bodies or victims that he leaves behind him, is just going to be part of the process. Now, this is just one part of the Ferguson story. If there's one thing that he doesn't care about, it is the truth, which is why he hires people who share the same flexibility when it comes to lying. They will continue to say whatever they're told to say, and our traditional media will ignore the lies because they've bought the narrative as well. And not just because they're basically focused on taking away our constitutional rights to protect ourselves. I mean, Ferguson seems to particularly enjoy releasing violent predators into our communities. He seems happy just to ignore the increasing murders, the drug addiction deaths, and all forms of government corruption. He always looks away, or he joins in making up everything far worse. And don't worry, however, because he will be happy to put Tim Eyman in prison, destroy small businesses for not wearing enough masks, hide public records from the public. I mean, he's destroyed them many times when he must. And of course, attack thrift stores for whatever dumb excuse that he could find. I mean, losing that lawsuit doesn't really matter to Ferguson because, again, it isn't his money. It's yours and mine. Now, regardless of how corrupt, dishonest, or terrible our public officials are, we still have to hold them accountable. We need to. Even if the traditional media looks the other way, and particularly when the worst and the most corrupt special interests in the state get behind them. In the end, we can't outsource our freedom and liberty to others. We can't expect somebody else to help us. That's just always a mistake when we assume that. And our founding fathers, they knew it as well. In fact, that's why we have a Bill of Rights in the first place. However, to hold them accountable, we must expose the truth about these politicians, these bureaucrats, and of course the grifters that just keep them going. Exposing the truth usually takes a lot of work. And it takes work, and you have to show up to be the person filing these very records requests. You have to process those records, and you got to pay attention to what the records say. I'm thankful that there's so many people in our state willing to stick to it, keep filing these records requests, keep paying attention, and keep exposing the truth. This is actually very important because the truth is what our politicians and the bureaucrat class, I believe, fear the most. This is why they want to censor us so badly. The truth is what exposes their corruption, and they know it, which is why they're so vicious about promoting their consensus narrative. However, to expose the truth, we have to show up, because as much as our political class hates to admit it, and as much as they want to fight us and hurt us, the future inevitably is going to belong to those who show up, and these guys actually know it.